What's up, ladies and gentlemen? I'm Cody Campbell with High Ground Gaming, and today we are reviewing the XPG S70 Blade M.2 NVMe SSD. I know, that's a mouthful. I'm going to start by walking you through the specs, and then I will give you my review. Stick around. The S70 Blade comes in three sizes. You can get a 500 gigabyte one, a 1 terabyte one, or a 2 terabyte one. The one that they sent us for testing was the 1 terabyte version. The form factor is an M.2 NVMe, and it also comes with PCIe 4.0 connectivity. It supports NVMe 1.4 and it has SLC caching. We didn't really do an unboxing for this one because it was just a chip in a box, but if you're really into that sort of thing, here you go. Now let's get into the review portion. As always, I'm going to start off by talking about the build quality. The design on this thing is pretty nice looking. It's got a pretty simple black aesthetic when it doesn't have a cover on it, which will blend kind of seamlessly in there. But when you put the heatsink cover on there, which is optional, by the way, you don't have to use it, but you can use it for more thermal distribution. It's really nice. There's sort of a black brushed metal surface to it. It does have some XPG branding, which, depending on whether or not you're a fan of branding, you will love or hate, but it is what it is. And there's some sort of trapezoidal, triangle-shaped silver lines running through it, which is pretty cool looking in my opinion. The heatsink is slim though. That's where the Blade name comes from, I assume. And that's gonna have some pros and some cons. Pros is that it's gonna fit into tighter spaces, which is why it's useful for the PS5. Big ol' heat sinks don't really fit in the PS5 super well, but the Blade is made to work really well with that. Also really nice for smaller form factor builds. If you don't want to build your PC in a giant tower, then having it in a smaller form factor, you want to conserve as much space as possible, and having a narrow heatsink like this is really nice. The downside to that is that a smaller heatsink doesn't magically distribute the same amount of heat as a bigger heatsink. So the regular S70, which is I believe about the same price, has a bigger, fattier heatsink that's going to be better for heat distribution than the S70 Blade. So for most people who are interested in this specific chip, if you have a big tower PC and you've got the space, you're probably going to want the one with the bigger heatsink. But if you're limited on space, that's where the Blade starts looking really attractive. But let's get into what actually matters about this SSD, and that's speed. One of the biggest leaps forward in recent computing memory was when we switched from spinning hard drives to SSDs. NVMe SSDs are even faster, and now we've got a PCIe GEN4 M.2 NVMe SSD, and it is insanely fast. XPG has the read speed listed as 7,400 megabytes per second, or 6,100 megabytes per second on the PS5, and the write speed is listed as 6,800 megabytes per second. Now that's really fast. My silicone power drive that I use has a 2,200 megabytes per second read and a 1,600 megabytes per second write. So on paper, the XPG drive blows mine completely out of the water. In practice, I found that it was just a little bit different. In fairness, my motherboard is not a PCIe Gen4 motherboard, so my testing is not going to conclude the maximum output that this chip is capable of. But I just wanted to share my results so that you could see what you might get if you also have a PCIe Gen3 motherboard, since most people probably haven't made that switch just yet. For reference, I use an Asus ROG Strix B450F2 motherboard. I used user benchmarks to do my testing, and my results were pretty good, but not nearly as good as I was expecting. My computer managed to achieve read speeds of 2,376 megabytes per second and write speeds of 2,795 megabytes per second. So while my write speed was about half of the maximum output promised, the read speed was less than a third. In comparison, my silicone power drive was actually much closer to the mark. So since I thought maybe that's the power of PCIe Gen 4, maybe it's so much faster and that my computer just isn't capable of getting anywhere near the maximum output on this. So I went into the user benchmark archives and I looked at other people's test scores. I looked specifically at test scores that used PCIe Gen 4 motherboards, and I found that they were much better than my results, but still nowhere close to the promised maximum speeds. Other users that had PCIe Gen 4 motherboards found read speeds in the high 2000s and write speeds in the high 4000s. It was kind of interesting how the write speeds are just so much faster, but nobody really came close to the promised read speed of 7,400 megabytes per second. Still, I found that in practical application, the drive is incredibly fast. Any M.2 NVMe SSD is really going to cut down on your loading times and your launch times with games. But I found one of the biggest tests for drive speed's practical use in gaming is with large open world role-playing games. You play games like The Witcher, GTA 5, Skyrim, pretty much anything by Bethesda. And what you do is you just load into an area and see if you're going to start spotting texture pop-ins. That's a sign that your drive isn't fast enough to keep up with your games. So I tested with some Horizon Zero Dawn because that's a game that I've had issues with that in the past. I also played some Skyrim just to see how quick the loading and fast traveling worked. And I'm pleased to say that I had fantastic results with both. Skyrim, the loading screens, the fast travel, it was nearly instantaneous. I've never actually traversed that game and had everything work so quickly. Horizon Zero Dawn, I did still see a couple of texture pop-ins when I was really looking for them, but honestly, it was the best experience I've ever had with that game. I've always had issues with texture pop-ins in Horizon, and this was the first time that I haven't spotted a single one, so that was pretty cool, I thought. So, let's get down to the verdict. The SSD MSRP's at $159.99. That is a pretty medium price. It's cheaper than options from Samsung and has a higher promised speed. As we saw, it doesn't really quite live up to those promised numbers in most practical testing, but the speeds that it does achieve are still pretty darn fast, and while there are a couple slightly more affordable options, the fact that it's 1 terabyte, that it's PCIe Gen 4, that it comes with this narrow heatsink, which is pretty unique for this design, I think that there's a real market for this, particularly among PS5 and small form factor PC users. So keeping all that in mind, we're actually giving this a 4.4 out of 5. Yes, it gets a little bit of a dock because it doesn't quite live up to its promised speeds, but let's be honest, those speeds at this price would be pretty ridiculous. It's still a pretty good value, and I found that it works really well. Why don't you go ahead and leave a comment down below, let us know what you think about it. While you're at it, hit that subscribe button. We would really appreciate it. All right, everybody, thanks for watching. Happy gaming.